Hi everyone and welcome. In this video, we'll have a deep dive into business rules. We will start with a general overview to understand what they are and how they work. After that, we will learn how to create and configure business rules based on specific requirements, debug them to identify and correct errors, and call them from a process. A business rule is an application object that is designed for performing various calculations and configuring the decision-making logic in a visual editor. There are two types of business rules: tree-like business rules and diagram business rules. A tree-like business rule is a tree of blocks, where each block has its own execution condition. A diagram business rule is a set of graphic blocks, where in each block you can calculate the values of business rule attributes or attributes of the object passed to this business rule as input. A business rule always contains one start block, also called initial block, where it begins its execution. In a diagram business rule, all blocks are connected with arrow transitions, and each transition contains a UML expression that defines on which condition this transition is followed. A business rule can be bound to a UDM type that exists in the application. In this case, each time the business rule is called, it takes one of this type's objects as input and is executed based on this object. This object's attributes become input attributes of the business rule. The initial values of these input attributes can either be the actual values recorded in this object's attributes, or they can be set manually in the business rule. However, a business rule does not have to be bound to a type. It can exist without it. In this case, initial values of its input attributes can only be set manually. Let's take a look at a specific case to see how business rules work. In this application, we already have the type called clients with attributes date of birth, first name, last name, and average monthly income, and we also have a process that contains a single script block. At the moment, this block is empty, but we will use it a bit later. Let's configure a business rule that will check this client's solvency or paying capacity based on their date of birth and average monthly income. To create a business rule, click the plus button on the toolbar and select Business Rule in the menu. In the creation window, specify its location and enter its name. As I mentioned before, you can bind a business rule to a UDM type. In this case, we will bind it to the client's type. Below, we have three checkboxes. The first checkbox defines the type of the business rule. If it is selected, this business rule will be a tree-like business rule. If it is not selected, it will be a diagram business rule. In our case, we want to work with a diagram, so we will leave it unselected. The second checkbox, which is selected by default, defines the order in which business rule blocks are processed. If it is selected, the business rule follows only the first branch where the specified conditions are met, or an unconditional branch if the conditions are not met anywhere. In case of tree-like business rules, the order of blocks in the tree plays a role because the branches are processed from top to bottom. If the checkbox is not selected, the business rule will follow all branches where the conditions are met, as well as all unconditional branches. The third checkbox allows the business rule to start executing from any block. This allows for using some additional functions, for example, one for calculating business rules partially, and so on. We will leave it unselected. If necessary, you can also enter a description for the business rule, but it is optional. Click Save. In each business rule, you can create a set of attributes. For that, click Attributes on the toolbar. Business rule attributes can be either input-output attributes or internal ones. These are the attributes used for internal calculations. Let's add several attributes. To add an attribute, click Add on the toolbar. In most cases, a business rule contains some Boolean attribute that indicates whether or not the business rule has been passed successfully. Let's create one and call it BR passed. Next, let's create a string attribute for example, comment, to store the result of the business rules execution. For instance, the reason why it was not passed. Let's add one more attribute. It will be a float number and will define the income margin of the client. This time, it will not be an input-output attribute, but instead it will be used for calculations inside the business rule. For that, uncheck the input-output box. Save the attributes. Now let's build the diagram of the business rule. To add a new block, double-click anywhere in the business rules workspace. Enter the name of the block. By default, the first block becomes the start block and is colored red. Later on, you can appoint a different block to be the start block. Other blocks are added in the same way. First of all, we need to check whether or not the client passed to the business rule has all the needed information, that is, the date of birth and average monthly income. To do this, we'll add a block that will be responsible for the case when this data is absent. We will call it No Data. Next, we will split clients in two groups, younger than 35 and older than 35. Finally, the last blocks will be for the cases when the business rule is either passed or not passed. Now we need to connect these blocks with each other. When you click on a block, a set of icons appears above it. The first icon, that looks like an arrow, is what we need to create transitions. Click on this arrow, hold down the left mouse button, and drag the mouse pointer to the target block. Now these two blocks are connected. Do the same with the rest of the blocks. The second icon in the set opens the block editor. Here you can set initial values of business rule attributes. You can select existing attributes from the drop-down list. The third icon deletes the selected block. When you select a transition, it has similar icons for opening the transition editor and deleting the transition. Now, let's configure UDML expressions for these transitions. The transition editor is a UDML editor. On the right, you can see the list of available UDML functions, and in the Objects and Attributes section, attributes of the client's type. As you remember, we bound this business rule to this type when it was created, and this way defined its context. Apart from the type's attributes, the business rule has access to its own attributes. Here, it's worth noting that the names of business rule attributes must not match the names of the type's attributes. In this transition, we need to make sure that the type object received by the business rule has the data we will be working with later. For that, we will use the function ifNull. With this function, we will compose the following expression. This means that if either the date of birth or monthly income is empty, we will end up in the branch called No Data. In the block editor, we can set values of output attributes. In this case, the BR_passed attribute will be false, and the comment will be saying that there is not enough data. Save the block and configure other branches in a similar way. Now we can specify the income that each group of clients, younger than 35 and older than 35, must have. Let's say that clients younger than 35 must earn more than 1,200 euros a month, and clients older than 35 must earn more than 2,500 euros a month. Here, we need to set the condition that the client is either younger than 35 or turning 35 today. For that, we will use the function dateYear that takes the year from the date passed to it as input and adds or subtracts the specified number of years from it. In our case, it will be 35. After that, we need to make sure that the resulting number is less than or equal to the current date. We will use the function today that returns the current date. Save the block. Now, if we end up in this branch, we'll define the income margin required for this category of clients. It will be 1,200 euros. Save the block. In this transition, we need to set the condition that the client is older than 35. Respectively, here the income margin is 2,500 euros. To avoid the situation when transition conditions overlap, making it hard to understand what each transition means, you can specify the title of each transition. These titles will be displayed instead of conditions, and the diagram will be more readable. After passing one of these blocks, we will check what the client's average monthly income is, and based on this value define whether the business rule is passed or not. Here, we need to make sure that the client's average monthly income is not below the specified margin. Set the condition and save the block. If we follow this transition and end up in the passed block, the BR passed attribute will be set to true. The comment will be saying that the business rule is passed successfully. Of course, if necessary, you can specify any text that may be useful to display in the form. In this transition, set the opposite condition. In this case, the BR passed attribute will be set to false. The comment will be saying that the client's income does not meet the requirements. Similar conditions must be set in the transitions from the more than 35 block. Here, the expressions will be the same, but the income margin attribute will store another value. Save the business rule. Now, we can debug the business rule right here in the editor. For that, click Start Debugging on the toolbar. This will open a debugging panel at the bottom of the screen. To test the business rule, we need to select a context object, that is, the type object passed to the business rule as input. Since the rule is bound to the client's type, we can choose any object that exists in this type. For test purposes, the type contains clients with different combinations of data. Some have all data, some lack the date of birth or monthly income value, so that all business rule branches can be tested. Let's select a client who lacks some data. To start debugging, you can click either Start. In this case, the business rule will be executed from beginning to end, or Step Forward. In this case, the debugger will stop at each execution step, and we will be able to see exactly where we are in the business rule. After the business rule has reached the end, we can see the values of its output attributes. In this case, the client lacks some data, therefore the BR passed attribute is set to false, and the comment says that there is not enough data. Let's select another client. Note that the date of birth indicates that they are older than 35, and the income is above the margin. Click Step Forward. As you can see, we were directed to the block less than 35, and this tells us that something is configured incorrectly. If we check the transition conditions, we will see that, indeed, the expression must have another comparison sign. Change the signs, save the business rule, and start debugging again. Now we can see that the business rule has followed the correct branch, more than 35. As the next step, it will check the client's income. The income was above the margin, therefore we ended up in the past block. The next step brings us to the end of the business rule, and we can see the values of its output attributes. Just in case, let's test one more client. For example, one who is younger than 35. Select the client, click Start. The business rule has been executed fully, and we can see that it has been passed, which means that the client has proper paying capability. Now that we know that the business rule is working correctly, we need to call it from the needed place in the application. We will call it from the script block in the process. For that, we will use the UDML function calculateStrategy. This function returns an object that contains the path to the business rule and all its output attributes. This function takes 3 parameters. The first one is the full path to the business rule, or its qualified name. It can be taken from the browser's address bar. It consists of the name of the model, name of the package, and name of the object. The second parameter is the type object passed to the business rule. The type this object belongs to must match the type that the business rule is bound to. In this case, it's an object of the client's type. Since the process doesn't contain any attributes referencing this type, we can either create such an attribute or create a JavaScript variable. This is what we'll do. This variable will store a specific object of the client's type received using the byId search method. For example, the first client. As a result, we can now specify this JavaScript variable as the second argument of the calculateStrategy function. Enter JS, type of the variable, in this case main, clients, then in the brackets, name of the variable. The third parameter is responsible for collecting the business rule statistics. For example, if the business rule is called from a loop for a set of objects, its performance statistics can be recorded and then processed. Right now, we will not be doing that, therefore we'll pass an empty value. As I mentioned earlier, this function returns an object. However, it will be enough for us to get the value stored in the comment attribute of the business rule. Since this is a string attribute, we can record its value to the process attribute result. To access a single field of the object, in our case, comment, we will use the field function. After the calculateStrategy function, add a dot, type field, and in the brackets, enter the name of the needed field, comment. Now everything is configured. The business rule is called for the client with ID 1, and then the value of its comment attribute is recorded to the result process attribute. Save the script, then save the process. Let's run the process. On the Monitoring tab, we can see that the process instance has finished its execution. We can switch to the History tab and see what value is recorded in the result attribute. Here, the result is that the client's income does not meet the requirements. Let's have a look at this client and the data. This client is younger than 35, and the average monthly income is less than 1,200 euros. Thus, we can see that the business rule has been executed correctly. Let's select a client who will pass the business rule, for example, with ID 3. Change the client's ID in the process and run it. We can see that the business rule executed in the last process instance has been passed successfully. And this brings us to the end of the video. Today, we have taken a closer look at business rules. We have learned about different types of business rules, learned to create and configure them based on certain requirements, debug them, and call them from a process.